Hi, BookTube, and welcome to my wrap up of the Man Booker International Prize. The books that I've read from that list. The original long list was 12 books, and I found that when it came out, I'd already read 3 of them. So I went on to look up the rest, and there were another 2 that I fancied. And I had hoped I was going to talk about all 5, but of course I got my timings wrong, and the shortlist was announced earlier this week. So of the 5 that I've read, 3 of them made it to the shortlist, so I'm going to talk about those. Last year's winner was David Grossman's A Horse Walks into a Bar, which I read and I didn't think a lot of, to be honest. Not that it wasn't a good book, well written, but it was a subject I was very familiar with, which is sort of stand-up comedy. So I've done a lot of reading around that. So it didn't really tell me anything I didn't already know. So that was a bit of a sort of unfortunate sort of set of circumstances that meant I didn't particularly get on with that book. So last year was before I was on BookTube, so anything I'd read on that list was purely coincidental because I read it because I wanted to read that author. This year I've been slightly more systematic about it since joining BookTube and seen other BookTubers talk about the prize, and they're determined to read all 12, which I'm more of a mood reader, so I'm never going to do that. But anyway, on with the list. So the 2 that I added to having read what that list was Virginie Despentes' Vernon Subutex 1 and Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadawi. The 3 that I'd previously read, one was Jenny Erpenbeck's Go Gone Went, which didn't make it to the shortlist. Another was Binet's The Seventh Functional Language, which also didn't make it to the shortlist. And the third was Han Kang's The White Book, which did make it to the shortlist. So briefly to talk about those. So I have a dedicated video on the Han Kang, so I'll post the link to that. Binet, as you followers of my vlog will know, was my book of the year last year, so I'm rather disappointed that it didn't make it onto the shortlist. But I'm not surprised for reasons which I'll go into right at the end. And then the Jenny Erpenbeck was... I was really disappointed in that book. For me, having read all of her novels, it's by far the weakest. It's about the sort of African migrants in Germany who sort of have no real status, so they can't work, they can't do anything. They're in these sort of terrible sort of halfway sort of houses. And a German academic who has retired and whose wife has died recently is very much also drifting and at a loss to know what to do. And he sort of hooks up with these guys and tries to help them and stuff. But it's a novel entirely about drift and going nowhere, which I think is the point, because these sort of stateless and rootless people, that's what they do. But it didn't make it for a very entertaining read. And Sean the Book Maniac, who does a brilliant page 112 tag, whereby he considers page 112 of lots of different novels to help him decide which one of them shall he read. And he did one for the Man Booker International. And it's so happy he didn't know which 3 books that he was reading page 112 from, but when he read the Erpenbeck, I recognised it. Sean didn't know, hadn't read the book, wasn't familiar with it, and he was absolutely staggered by how bad the writing was. And in isolation, I have to agree. I mean, that page read so badly. And it's a very entertaining video, and I'm going to post the link to it. But the Erpenbeck was just poor. And I think it made the list because the subject matter is important and needs writing about in fiction. I think that's why it's there, rather than the merits of the book itself. Okay, so on to these 2 books. I'm going to start with Virginie Despentes' Vernon Subutex. Now, I quite enjoyed this. But it is relentlessly misanthropic and misogynist, which is it's very like Welbeck's attitude to women, but this is written by a woman, which is slightly strange. And because it's sort of that tone all the way through, I can't really imagine this winning. It's quite a bleak book. It's basically about Paris of intellectuals, artists, drug dealers, transvestites, whores. It's a bit like Lou Reed's Walk on the Wild Side song set in Paris, but the difference is Lou Reed's characters are all sort of working class and marginals, whereas these are the successful people in Paris. Copywriters, film producers, filmmakers, and they're all exactly the same. They're all, sort of having affairs, being unfaithful to their partners. They all take drugs. This is why I say it's relentlessly misanthropic. And it goes on like this for the entirety of the book. And right at the end, Vernon Subutex, who is the man who sort of holds it all together, it's in literally the last paragraph of the book is suggested to be there's some sort of everyman that reflects back on all these other folk in the book. But he's not very likable either. He used to own a record shop called Revolver, which suffered from the digital revolution in music, and so he had to sell his shop, and he's basically has no money. And a musician friend of his called Alex Bleach basically pays for his rent, and when Alex Bleach dies suddenly, Vernon is thrown onto the streets because he has no means of supporting himself, and he goes from one sofa to another sofa of his friends and acquaintances, and that's what the book is. And sometimes Vernon is in the chapter, and sometimes he isn't. It's just about the friends, which is a strange structure in itself. I mean, it is literally, I suppose it's almost like a sort of a flaneur, not of the city of Paris, but of people's houses. And there are chapter after chapter after chapter where he's not in it at all. It's just talking about the various people in this circle and network of his, which, to say, doesn't really work for me. But he steals from one of the friends he's staying with. He's very unfaithful to women himself. So this thing about him being an everyman, showing the others in stark relief, doesn't really work because he's not that likable either. And I'm just going to read one bit about to demonstrate the sort of misogyny of Despentes. I mean, this reads like someone who's settling a lot of old scores. What could be better than sleeping with the boyfriend of a best friend, especially when they seem so happy together? A quick blowjob in the lift cures the jealousy brought on by other people's happiness. It's not very nice, but I did enjoy it. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads, but it's really only a 3.5. As is this, Frankenstein in Baghdad. The first thing to say is, that's quite a nice cover. We got the sort of the stitching of the Frankenstein monster stitched together. I'm going to look forward to reading this. So let's open it up and wait a minute, it's upside down. What's this? Cover that's that way up. Now I don't know if this is only my copy, or I don't know if it's a comment on how sort of Semitic languages, Arabic and Hebrew, are written from right to left as against our left to right. But that was quite off-putting. Let me know if you've got a copy of this and yours is the right way up, or whether they're all like this. Okay, so this starts off as with the time when Baghdad was occupied by the Americans, and there was lots of militias and Al Qaeda and all sort of opposing them, and it was a desperate place to live. It's just sort of death on the streets every day with suicide bombs and that. And a junk dealer called Hadi is asked by a friend to go to the morgue to sort of bring back the remains of someone who's died. And when he gets there, he finds that because of the nature of high explosive, of suicide bombs, of American plane dropped bombs, that flesh, human bodies are no longer intact. The dead, they're just blown to smithereens. And there's just this sort of heap of body parts, and you can't tell what belongs to what. And he's absolutely appalled by this. And he's advised, well, just scoop up a body's worth and take it back and bury that. So he as I say, he's appalled by this. And in his garden, he builds a corpse out of different body parts that he sort of scavenges from fresh outrages. And the latest one is outside a hotel. A truck bomb goes off and kills the guard who's on duty at that hotel. And that guard's soul is separated from his sort of blown up body. And as he's floating around, desperate, craving to be, rehoused in a body, he sees this corpse in Hadi's back garden, and he enters it, and in doing so, animates it. So that's the premise of the book, and that's why it's obviously a Frankenstein tale. And this sort of monster, which is called What's Its Name by Hedy, goes around avenging the people who cause the death of every different body part on him. And all sorts of things are projected on him by the different aspects of Iraqi society. He comes to represent lots of different things. And in his task, there's a time limit because he does start, the various body parts start putrefying and drop off him. And also when he successfully avenges a body part, that body part also drops off him. So in order to stay intact, he has to get fresh flesh. So he not only is now avenging people, he's actually turned into a murderer because he needs the flesh to keep. So even he has lost the original, meaning of why he's come into being, and it's a very interesting concept. One of the things is obviously we've got that transition from an avenger to a murderer to self-sustain. His motivation is to sustain his own being, and even he is no longer clear as to what his purpose is. And so the whole sort of moral ambiguity is much more sort of grey rather than black and white. So just to give you, so this is when he's on his phase of avenging. The two dead beggars were victims of Axe's stupidity, and the two surviving beggars were criminals because they'd killed the two other beggars by mistake when they were trying to tackle What's Its Name. So What's Its Name strangled them to avenge the beggars they had killed. Because they had been secretly planning to do the same thing to him, and because the four of them would have failed in any attempt to kill him anyway, and this is the underlying significance of what happened on that strange night. They were intent on suicide, but hadn't found a good way to commit it until the What's Its Name appeared, strolling down the dark lane in Daniel's old clothes. So he's basically saying, all these sort of, militias and all of that, they're because of the death cult nature of what they do, they're looking to die. And suicide bombing is the perfect apotheosis of that. It's hard to convince anyone of this nonsense, but organised nonsense of this kind stands behind all crimes committed, said Mahmood, who was a journalist. He then resumed a re-narration of the strange details. The What's Its Name had been planning something completely different instead of getting involved in fights with people who weren't his enemies in the first place. He had no doubts about his ability to survive, however hard the others tried to kill him. But he wasn't looking for stardom or a chance to show off or display his strength, nor did he intend to frighten people. He was on a noble mission and had to carry it out with as few complications as possible. So after the incident with the four beggars and another incident in which a police vehicle accidentally hit him in the street near the Liberty Monument, he decided not to move around in the open and to avoid people as much as possible. So I think what the author's saying here is that, everybody potentially is a criminal. It's not just the murderers and the suicide bombers, but it's also the corrupt officials who end up killing people because they're forced from their homes or they don't deal with the dirty water. Some people get infections and die from diseases like cholera and all of this. He's basically saying everyone is a criminal in this crazy situation. And that's fine. I think there's some really interesting and important ideas there. The problem is the narrative structure. Time is all over the place in this. You go from one chapter to another and it's the next day, which is fine. And then you go to the next chapter and without being told or realising it seems to have jumped ahead by a week. It's really ill-disciplined in that respect. And also the monster, the What's Its Name monster, it starts off and it shows him actively killing people for revenge. And then it's only ever really referred to after the event and, it doesn't explain the murders. It's sort of more his own sort of meditations on what lies behind them. So it's gone from an active sort of, describing into a sort of passive info dump, really. And there's one scene in the book which is the monster is self-recording an interview for the journalist who wants to get his story. And all the ideas of the book are contained in that, and it's a very strong section, but it kind of almost renders redundant the rest of the book. So again, I only gave this 4 stars, which was really 3.5 stars, because it wasn't a great read. I'd say there's lots to admire in terms of what he was saying about the sort of the madness in Iraq and people's culpabilities and people's mentalities behind it. But, again, I can't really imagine that winning. I mean, it may win, but I can't imagine why it should win as a work of literature. So those are the two that I've read on the with Han Kang. So just briefly on the Han Kang I love the Han Kang book. It's beautiful, but it's a morsel. It's very short, and again, it's not weighty enough to win a prize. I don't think. And of the other three on the list, well, one is Laszlo Krasznahorkai, but it's a book of short stories. How can you compare short stories to a novel to decide which is the best? That makes no sense to me. I read his Sibo There Below and didn't enjoy it, so I had no yearning to read this. The next was Antonio Munoz Molina, Like a Fading Shadow. And this didn't grab me at all because it's James Earl Ray, the man who assassinated Martin Luther King, goes on the run and ends up in Lisbon, where he's eventually captured. And I'm so tired of sort of, real life historical figures taken by authors in order to talk about themselves as writers, which apparently this is what Munoz does, because it's a sort of three narrative structure. One is James Earl Ray, one is Molina struggling to find his literary voice as an author, and the author in 1987, and the other is the author in the present, reflecting on his life, and the form of the novel as an instrument for imagining the world through another person's eyes. Well, I've said before, and I'll say it again, writers writing about writing is really self-indulgent. Who cares? And then to sort of take this real-life historical person, which may be an interesting story in itself, but to sort of subsume it and make it serve, the greater purpose of an author, navel gazing. I just wasn't interested in that at all. And then the third and last one, making up the six, is Flights by Olga Tokarczuk, who's Polish. And it's on Fitzcarraldo editions. And I've read virtually every fiction book that Fitzcarraldo editions put out because I love Fitzcarraldo editions. And this is the first one whose blurb has made me think, I'm not interested in this, which is quite an achievement for this now ending up on the International Man Booker Prize. So I'm just going to read you the blurb. Interweaves travel narratives and reflections of travel with an in-depth exploration of the human body, broaching life, death, motion and migration. Okay, well, potentially, that sounds interesting. But then, what do we got? From the 17th century, we have the story of the Dutch anatomist Philip Verheyen, who dissected and drew pictures of his own amputated leg. From the 18th century, we have the story of a North African-born slave turned Austrian courtier, stuffed and put on display after his death. In the 19th century, we follow Chopin's heart as it makes the covert journey from Paris to Warsaw. In the present, we have the trials of a wife accompanying her much older husband as he teaches a course on a cruise ship in the Greek islands, and the harrowing story of a young husband whose wife and child mysteriously vanish on a holiday on the Croatian island. With her signature grace and insight, Olga Tokarczuk guides the reader beyond the surface layer of modernity towards the core of the very nature of humankind. Well, again, I've read so many stories, Napoleon's penis is detached from his body and the strange tale of what happens to that. Einstein's brain, which was studied because he was such a genius, and, where did that end up on? I've seen documentaries on that as well as read short stories. Jeremy Bentham's Automaton or whatever, which is preserved in University College London, and all this. I'm bored. I'm bored with this device. It's not interesting. It doesn't sort of. I can't believe it gives us any new insights onto the relationship of human anatomy, and mind and space and travel. So this book had no appeal to me at all, I'm afraid. So, long story short, I don't care who wins this prize. And having read David Grossman, which won the prize last year, that seems to be consistent. And I have a wider question. I looked at the judging panel and they're all British. Now, I know the Man Booker Prize is, based in Britain, so it makes sense that they're all British. But this is a prize for international authors from all over the globe whose books appear in English. So I can't help feeling there should be some diversity on that panel. They shouldn't all be British based. And that's why I say Binet's book, The Seventh Functional Language, never would have won. It's too French. It's about sort of French academics in the 1980s. It's about semiotics, which is much more significant in French academia than it is in Britain. And I knew that would never get onto the shortlist, let alone win, because British authors aren't particularly interested in that sort of thing. To be honest, I was amazed that this made it onto it, because this is very French as well, and in a different way. This is a sort of French misanthropism, Pache Molière and all of that. But it did make it. I don't, I don't understand. I've decided I don't understand this prize. Why you would have a sort of imperialist British panel sitting in judgment on books from the rest of the globe, and they're just going to feed their British values into it. So all in all, this is a really sort of disappointing. We'll see what next year's brings, but this is a really disappointing experience for me. But finally, I don't know if you can see this, the author picture of Virginie Despentes with a cigarette in her mouth. And that photo is exactly proof of why Virginie Despentes deserves to be sort of part of the French Belles Lettres. And I'm now going to present the Tome Raider Guide to How to Be a French Author. So till next time, thanks very much.